Dust choked the stagnant air of the abandoned Appalachian cabin, but it wasn't the scent of decay that made Caleb's blood run cold. It was the brittle, yellowed parchment concealed beneath the rotting floorboards. A map, not to buried gold, but to a century-old secret someone had already killed to keep hidden. Caleb Mercer sat in the uncomfortably pristine office of Mitchell Garner, a high-priced probate attorney whose silk tie probably cost more than Caleb's entire monthly rent. The city noise of Charlotte, North Carolina, was muffled behind thick, soundproof glass, leaving only the rhythmic, agonizing ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Caleb, a 32-year-old freelance archivist, drowning in the insurmountable weight of his late mother's medical debts and a failing career, stared blankly at the brass key resting on the polished mahogany desk. Elias Mercer, a great-uncle Caleb hadn't seen since a deeply uncomfortable Thanksgiving 2 decades ago, had passed away. The man had been a phantom in the family tree, an eccentric recluse who severed ties with humanity to live off the grid in the dense, unforgiving wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, through a bizarre twist of legal default, Caleb was his sole heir. The inheritance wasn't a sprawling estate or a hidden fortune. It was a solitary, dilapidated cabin situated on 3 acres of untamable woodland just outside the remote town of Oak Haven. The drive to Oak Haven took 4 exhausting hours, winding through serpentine mountain roads that seemed to actively reject the presence of outsiders. The pavement eventually surrendered to a rugged dirt path, severely punishing the suspension of Caleb's aging sedan. Dense canopies of ancient pine and oak trees blocked out the afternoon sun, casting long, skeletal shadows across the windshield. By the time the cabin finally materialized through the thick foliage, twilight had begun to settle, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and deep gray. The structure itself was a monument to isolation. It was a single-story log cabin, its timber grayed and deeply weathered by decades of harsh mountain storms. The porch sagged under the invisible weight of time, and the windows were caked in so much grime they looked like clouded eyes staring blindly into the forest. Caleb killed the engine, the sudden silence of the woods pressing against his ears until a lone crow shattered the quiet with a sharp, warning caw. Grabbing a heavy flashlight and his canvas duffel bag, he stepped out into the crisp, pine-scented air. Inserting Mitchell Garner's brass key into the rusted deadbolt required a violent twist and a hard shove against the swollen wooden door. It gave way with a tortured groan, releasing a stale, suffocating gust of air that smelled profoundly of mildew, old paper, and damp earth. Caleb clicked on his flashlight, the beam cutting through dancing clouds of disturbed dust motes. The interior was a frozen tableau of a solitary life. A heavy cast-iron wood stove dominated the center of the main room, surrounded by walls completely obscured by towering, haphazardly built bookshelves. Every horizontal surface was buried beneath stacks of yellowed newspapers, leather-bound ledgers, and tarnished camping equipment. For a man supposedly living a simple life, Elias had been a chronic hoarder of history. Caleb spent the first few hours merely trying to carve out a habitable space, wiping down a solid oak dining table and setting up a battery-powered camping lantern. As the wind picked up outside, whistling through the invisible cracks in the timber, the profound isolation of the cabin began to gnaw at his nerves. He needed to find something of value, a hidden savings bond, antique furniture, anything he could liquidate to appease the creditors breathing down his neck back in the city. It wasn't until the early hours of the morning, fueled by cold, instant coffee and sheer desperation, that Caleb noticed the anomaly. He was clearing a massive, ceiling-high bookshelf mounted against the northern wall. The shelves were crammed with books on local geology, obscure historical texts, and Appalachian folklore. As he pulled away a particularly heavy encyclopedia, he noticed the wooden backing of the shelf didn't sit flush with the log wall behind it. There was a gap, barely half an inch wide. Setting the book down, Caleb ran his fingers along the edge of the wood, feeling a subtle, unnatural ridge. He retrieved a flathead screwdriver from his duffel and carefully wedged it into the seam. With a sharp crack that echoed aggressively in the silent cabin, the wooden panel popped loose. It wasn't a structural backing. It was a false panel. Behind it lay a shallow cavity carved directly into the thick timber of the cabin wall. Caleb's breath hitched. Inside the hollowed-out space rested a small, tarnished tin box, the kind once used to store loose tobacco. His hands trembled slightly as he reached into the dark recess and pulled the box free. It was surprisingly light. He carried it over to the dining table, positioning it directly under the glaring white light of his lantern. The hinges screamed in protest as he forced the lid open. Inside, there were no gold coins, no wads of forgotten cash, and no life-changing bonds. There was only a piece of thick, folded parchment, heavily coated in a thin layer of protective wax, and a small, leather-bound notebook. Caleb carefully unfolded the brittle parchment. It was a map, hand-drawn with meticulous, almost obsessive precision. The ink was a faded sepia, detailing the surrounding topography of the Oakhaven Mountains. But it wasn't a standard geographical survey. Strange, cryptic symbols intersecting circles, jagged lines, and unfamiliar runic shapes were scattered across the terrain. At the bottom right corner, written in a hurried, frantic scrawl that vastly contrasted the precise cartography, were 3 words. They stole it. Frowning, Caleb picked up the leather-bound notebook. The pages were filled with Elias's chaotic handwriting, documenting dates stretching back to the late 1920s. As Caleb flipped through the fragile pages, his eyes caught fragments of sentences that made the hair on his arm stand up. The Oakhaven Trust, the missing ledger, the blood on their hands. This wasn't a map to buried treasure. It was a map leading to a forgotten crime scene, a blueprint of a historical cover-up that had financed the wealth of the entire town. And if his great-uncle Elias had found it, it meant Elias's sudden heart failure in the woods might not have been a natural death after all. The morning sun did little to burn away the chill that had settled deep in Caleb's bones. He hadn't slept. The map and the leather-bound notebook lay spread across the oak table, a terrifying puzzle demanding to be solved. Elias's notes were erratic, jumping between meticulous geological coordinates and paranoid rants about people watching him from the tree line. The recurring theme was a single devastating event, the 1928 collapse of the Oakhaven First National Bank. History recorded it as a tragic casualty of the impending Great Depression. Elias's notebook, however, claimed a much darker reality. It alleged that the town's founding families had orchestrated a massive embezzlement scheme, faking a robbery, collapsing the bank, and stealing the town's collective wealth to build their own private empires. The map, Elias claimed, pointed to the original, undoctored bank ledger, the ultimate proof of the betrayal, hidden away by a guilty conscience nearly a century ago. Caleb needed context, and more importantly, he needed to know if any of these accused families were still in power. He carefully folded the map, placed it inside a waterproof plastic sleeve, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his heavy canvas jacket. Leaving the cabin locked, he braved the tortuous drive down the mountain and into the heart of Oakhaven. The town was a picturesque illusion. Nestled in a valley, Oakhaven boasted immaculately preserved Victorian storefronts, quaint lampposts, and a pristine town square that looked plucked from a vintage postcard. It reeked of old, unbothered money. Caleb parked his dusty sedan outside the local historical society, a grand brick building that clearly received generous funding. Inside, the air smelled of floor wax and old bindings. Caleb approached the front desk, where a woman in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, was carefully cataloging a box of antique photographs. Her brass name tag read Sarah Collins. "Can I help you find something?" she asked, her tone polite but laced with the inherent caution. Small-town locals reserved for strangers. "I'm looking for public records regarding the 1928 bank collapse," Caleb said, trying to keep his voice casually detached. Specifically, any land deeds transferred immediately after the incident. Sarah's hands stopped moving. She looked up, her gaze instantly analyzing him. "That's quite specific. Usually, tourists just want to see the old train depot. Are you a researcher?" "An archivist," Caleb replied, handing her a slightly crumpled business card. "I'm settling the estate of a relative, Elias Mercer. He had a lot of notes on local history, and I'm trying to verify some of his work." The mention of Elias's name caused a subtle but undeniable shift in the room's atmosphere. Sarah's posture stiffened. Before she could answer, a heavy, booming voice echoed from the doorway behind them. Elias Mercer? Well, isn't that a blast from the past? Caleb turned to see a tall, impeccably dressed man in his 60s stepping into the lobby. He wore a tailored tweed suit that looked far too expensive for a sleepy mountain town. His silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and his smile didn't quite reach his pale, calculating eyes. "Leonard Hayes," the man said, extending a hand that Caleb reluctantly shook. It felt like gripping cold marble. "I'm the chairman of the Oakhaven Historical Preservation Board. And, incidentally, I own a good portion of the real estate around your uncle's property." Elias was a passionate man, prone to tall tales. "I hope you aren't taking his wild ramblings too seriously, Mr. Mercer. Just tying up loose ends," Caleb said smoothly, though his heart was beginning to race. Hayes was one of the surnames listed in Elias's notebook. "The Hayes family built their empire on the town's stolen ashes," Elias had written. "If you're looking to sell that awful cabin, I'd be happy to make you a very generous cash offer," Leonard said, his eyes locking onto Caleb's. "Save you the trouble of dealing with the local market. Elias's place is an eyesore, frankly, but the land has potential." "I haven't decided what I'm doing with the property yet," Caleb deflected, taking a step back. "But I'll keep your offer in mind." "Do that," Leonard smiled thinly. "And Mr. Mercer, the woods around here can be treacherous for city folks. Be careful where you go digging. The ground is unstable." Caleb left the Historical Society shortly after, his skin crawling with the distinct sensation of being watched. He skipped grabbing lunch, eager to get back to the supposed safety of the mountain. The drive back felt longer, the shadows of the trees appearing more sinister in the fading afternoon light. The sky had bruised into a dark, stormy gray, threatening a heavy mountain downpour. By the time he locked the cabin door behind him, the first fat drops of rain were violently hammering against the tin roof. Caleb built a fire in the wood stove, desperate to ward off the encroaching cold and the pervasive sense of dread. He pulled the map from his jacket, spreading it out on the table once more. He cross-referenced the coordinates with a modern topographical map he'd picked up at the town gas station. The symbols Elias had drawn seemed to converge on an abandoned logging camp situated roughly 2 miles north, deep within a treacherous ravine known locally as Devil's Drop. A sudden sharp crack from outside shattered his concentration. Caleb froze. It wasn't the sound of thunder, nor was it a falling branch. It was the distinct, heavy snap of dry wood under a boot. He instantly reached over and twisted the dial on his lantern, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the flickering, dull orange glow of the wood stove. Caleb held his breath, straining to hear over the deafening drum of the rain. There was a long, agonizing silence. Then, a heavy thud against the front porch. Someone was out there. Caleb's eyes darted around the room, settling on the heavy iron fire poker resting near the stove. He grabbed it, the cold metal grounding him as his adrenaline spiked. He pressed his back against the wall next to the front window, risking a quick glance through the grimy glass. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness outside, sweeping aggressively across the exterior of the cabin. The beam settled on the front door. The doorknob slowly, silently, began to turn. The rusted deadbolt, which Caleb had firmly locked, held fast. A muffled curse slipped through the heavy timber. Then, the sound of metal scraping against metal. They were trying to pick the lock. Caleb tightened his grip on the iron poker, his knuckles turning white. They weren't here to scare him. They had waited until the storm provided cover. They were here for Elias's map. And Leonard Hayes's thinly veiled threat suddenly echoed with terrifying clarity in Caleb's mind. "Be careful where you go digging." Caleb realized with a sickening lurch that he wasn't just inheriting a cabin. He had walked blindly into the crosshairs of a ruthless, century-old conspiracy. Caleb gripped the heavy iron fire poker, his knuckles stark white in the dim, flickering light of the wood stove. The metallic scraping at the door grew louder, more frantic, accompanied by the muffled curses of a man frustrated by the stubborn, rusted deadbolt. Caleb's mind raced, calculating the grim reality of his situation. He was miles away from the nearest paved road, lacking cellular service, and trapped inside a rotting wooden box with someone trying to break in. If Leonard Hayes's men got inside, they wouldn't just take the map. They would ensure Elias's heir suffered the exact same mysterious fate as Elias himself. In a surge of pure, Adrenaline-fueled desperation, Caleb didn't retreat. Instead, he lunged forward and slammed the heavy iron poker directly against the wooden center of the door with a deafening, thunderous crash. "I have a shotgun aimed right at your chest," Caleb roared, deepening his voice to project a violent, unhinged confidence he absolutely did not feel. "Next sound I hear is getting a slug through the wood." The scraping instantly stopped. A heavy silence fell over the porch, save for the relentless drumming of the rain against the roof. For 10 agonizing seconds, Caleb didn't dare to exhale. Then, he heard the distinct sound of boots hurriedly retreating down the wooden steps, squishing into the mud and fading into the dense, stormy timberland. Caleb collapsed against the door, his chest heaving, sliding down until he hit the dusty floorboards. He had bought himself time, but only a fraction of it. Hayes's men would realize he was bluffing, or they would simply return in daylight with overwhelming numbers. He couldn't stay in the cabin, and he couldn't go back to Oakhaven. His only option was to finish what Elias had started. By first light, the torrential storm had reduced itself to a persistent, chilling drizzle. Caleb moved with frantic efficiency. He packed his canvas duffel with the heavy flashlight, spare batteries, a coil of climbing rope Elias had left in the corner, a rusted but functional camp hatchet, and the waterproof sleeve containing the map and notebook. He secured a heavy hunting knife to his belt, a grim addition to his wardrobe, but a necessary one. The hike toward Devil's Drop was less of a trail and more of a brutal battle against the mountain itself. The terrain was incredibly unforgiving. The rain had transformed the steep, leaf-covered inclines into treacherous mudslides. Every step required absolute focus, testing the limits of Caleb's urban-accustomed stamina. Thick brambles tore at his heavy canvas jacket, and the dense canopy of ancient oaks and weeping pines blocked out the morning sun, bathing the forest in a sickly, pale twilight. As he navigated a particularly steep ridge, Caleb kept checking Elias's intricate map. The symbols were highly specific, 3 jagged stones resembling broken teeth. Caleb found them 2 hours into the hike. A massive, lightning-struck oak leaning dangerously to the east. He passed beneath its charred, skeletal branches 40 minutes later. Elias had charted this path over years of obsessive exploration, mapping a route that successfully bypassed the private property lines heavily guarded by Leonard Hayes's men. By noon, the trees suddenly broke, revealing the jagged, terrifying maw of Devil's Drop. It was a massive, naturally formed ravine, its sides plunging 100 feet down into a rocky, mist-choked basin. Clinging desperately to the near side of the cliff were the skeletal remains of the 1920s logging camp. Collapsed wooden platforms, rusted chains, and the rotting husks of steam-powered winches jutted out from the rocks like the bones of prehistoric beasts. Caleb carefully descended a narrow, precarious goat path that zigzagged down the face of the ravine. The air here was 10 degrees colder, smelling strongly of wet stone and decaying iron. According to Elias's final, frantic journal entry, the evidence wasn't hidden in the camp itself, but within the natural cave system the loggers had used to store their volatile blasting powder. Finding the cave entrance took another hour of exhausting searching. It was brilliantly concealed behind a cascading waterfall of mountain runoff, completely invisible from the ridge above. Caleb switched on his heavy flashlight and squeezed through the narrow, jagged fissure in the granite face. The interior of the cave was pitch black and claustrophobically tight. The sweeping beam of Caleb's flashlight revealed old wooden support beams, heavily bowed under the immense weight of the mountain. Discarded pickaxes and rusted powder kegs littered the uneven floor. He pressed deeper into the cavern, the air growing dangerously thin and tasting of heavy metallic dust. At the very back of the powder magazine, tucked beneath a collapsed pile of timber, Caleb saw it. It wasn't a chest or a dramatic vault. It was a simple, heavy-duty iron strongbox, the kind bank managers used in the early 20th century to transport bullion. It was chained to a massive iron ring, driven directly into the bedrock. The padlock securing the chain was incredibly old, a bulky brass mechanism coated in a thick layer of green verdigris. Caleb dropped to his knees, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He pulled the camp hatchet from his duffel. The padlock was old, but the metal was thick. It took 7 bone-jarring strikes, the sound echoing explosively through the tight cavern, before the brass shackle finally snapped with a sharp crack. He pulled the heavy iron box free from the chains and dragged it into a clearing. His hands were covered in rust and mud, shaking uncontrollably as he flipped the two rusted latches on the front of the box. With a tortured groan of metal, Caleb pried the heavy lid open, holding his breath as his flashlight beam illuminated the terrible, century-old truth hidden inside. The interior of the iron strongbox was remarkably dry, protected by thick layers of oiled canvas. Caleb carefully peeled back the heavy fabric, revealing a massive, leather-bound ledger. Embossed on the cover in faded gold lettering were the words, Oak Haven First National Bank, Master Account Record, 1,928. Beneath the ledger lay a stack of bound, official-looking documents and several bundles of remarkably well-preserved vintage currency. But the money was inconsequential compared to the explosive historical weight of the ledger. Caleb opened the heavy book. The pages were filled with immaculate, handwritten accounting entries. It only took him a few moments of scanning the columns to understand the absolute brilliance and pure malice of the crime. The ledger meticulously detailed the systematic siphoning of funds from hundreds of local farmers, miners, and small business owners. The money had been funneled directly into offshore accounts and dummy corporations owned by a shadow syndicate called the Oak Haven Trust. And there, listed plainly as the primary architects of the trust, were the founding fathers of the town's current elite. The name William Hayes, Leonard Hayes's grandfather, was written at the top of the beneficiary list, alongside the local magistrate, the chief of police, and the town's original mayor. They had orchestrated a fake robbery to trigger a bank run, used their authority to declare the bank insolvent, and legally foreclosed on the properties of the very citizens they had just bankrupted. They stole the town, piece by piece, using the stolen money to buy the land for pennies. A fascinating piece of fiction, isn't it? Caleb's blood turned to ice. He violently spun around, directing the beam of his flashlight toward the entrance of the cave. Standing in the narrow fissure, perfectly silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, was Leonard Hayes. He wasn't wearing his expensive tweed suit anymore. He was dressed in heavy, dark hunting gear. Flanking him were two heavily built men holding menacingly quiet, suppressed hunting rifles. "I have to admit, Mr. Mercer," Leonard said, his voice echoing coldly off the damp stone walls, "I didn't think you had the stomach for a hike like this. Elias was a mountain goat, but you're a city boy with bad credit. You should have taken my cash offer." "You killed Elias," Caleb said, his voice surprisingly steady as his hand slowly crept toward the hunting knife sheathed at his belt. "Elias had a weak heart," Leonard corrected smoothly, stepping further into the cavern. "My men simply startled him. A tragic accident in the wilderness, much like the one you are about to have. Hand over the ledger, Caleb. It belongs to my family." "It's proof of grand larceny and mass fraud," Caleb shot back, desperately scanning the cavern for an advantage. "You think you can just bury this again?" "I don't think it. I know it," Leonard chuckled darkly. "Who is going to stop me? The local sheriff plays golf at my country club. The town council answers to my board. You are a trespasser who fell down a deep, tragic ravine. Now, give me the book." The two armed men raised their rifles, stepping forward. Caleb's mind raced. He was outgunned, trapped, and entirely out of time. But as his flashlight beam swept across the ceiling of the cavern, he noticed something he had missed earlier. The wooden support beams directly above Leonard and his men were severely cracked, bowing heavily under the weight of the mountain. And resting dangerously precariously on the stone ledge right beside those supports were three ancient, rusted barrels marked with the faded, stenciled warning, "Danger, blasting, powder." Caleb didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy ledger in his left hand, and in one fluid, desperate motion, he hurled his heavy metal flashlight not at the men, but directly at the rotting wooden support beam above them. "Shoot him!" Leonard screamed. The heavy metal cylinder slammed into the compromised timber with brutal force. The beam shattered. A deafening, horrific groan echoed through the cavern as the ceiling instantly gave way. "Look out!" one of the gunmen yelled, diving backward. A massive deluge of rocks, dirt, and heavy timber violently crashed down, creating an impenetrable wall of debris between Caleb and the entrance. The rusted powder barrels plummeted with the rocks, bursting open and filling the air with a blinding, choking cloud of thick black dust. The sound of rifles firing was entirely drowned out by the roar of collapsing stone. Caleb didn't wait for the dust to settle. Coughing violently, he turned and sprinted deeper into the cave, relying on the faint ambient light filtering through the dust. Elias's map had shown a secondary ventilation shaft used by the loggers, a narrow chimney leading up to the ridge. He found it hidden behind a jagged rock formation. It was a suffocatingly tight, vertical climb. Driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct, Caleb shoved the ledger into his jacket and began to pull himself up the jagged stone chute. His fingers bled, his muscles screamed in agony, but he didn't stop until he burst through the surface, collapsing onto the wet forest floor, gasping for the cold, sweet mountain air. He didn't stop to rest. He ran. He navigated the treacherous woods under the cover of the incoming dusk, entirely bypassing his cabin and heading straight for the distant highway. Caleb didn't take the evidence to the corrupt local authorities in Oakhaven. He hitchhiked 300 miles straight to the FBI field office in Charlotte, slamming the 1,928 ledger down on a federal agent's desk. The resulting investigation was entirely devastating. The federal authorities, hungry for a high-profile corruption bust, dismantled the Oakhaven Trust piece by piece. The historical land deeds were frozen, the fraudulent trusts were seized, and Leonard Hayes was indicted on a staggering list of federal racketeering and extortion charges. Caleb never returned to the cabin. He sold the entire property to a state conservation fund for a massive, life-changing sum. He paid off his mother's medical debts in a single afternoon. The map and the leather-bound notebook remained locked in a safety deposit box. A stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous monsters don't hide in the dark. They hide behind expensive suits and stolen legacies. If you found yourself holding your breath during Caleb's terrifying escape, hit that like button. Real-life historical mysteries are always stranger and far more dangerous than fiction. What would you do if you found a map to a century-old crime scene hidden in your walls?